On February 4, 2010, the McStay family vanished without a trace. One moment they were a normal family, living in California, and the next, their home was left eerily abandoned. Did they simply decide to disappear, or was there something darker lurking behind their sudden departure? As investigators comb through evidence and examine bizarre clues, the case raises a chilling question. Was this a tragic escape, or a sinister crime? The McStay family had everything going for them. Joseph McStay, a successful entrepreneur, lived in a spacious home in Fallbrook, California, with his wife, Summer, and their two young children, Gianni and Joseph Jr., to those who knew them. They were a picture of happiness, happy, well-adjusted, and family-oriented. Joseph was running a thriving business, and Summer, a devoted mother, was the cornerstone of the family. They were well-liked by their community, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The evening of February 4, 2010, began like any other. Joseph had spent the day working on his business and was preparing for a weekend getaway with his family. Summer, as usual, was caring for their two young boys, ensuring they were set for the upcoming weekend. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and the family appeared to be in good spirits. However, the next day, things took an unsettling turn. Family and friends who had planned to meet the McStays the following day were unable to reach them. Calls went unanswered, and messages went unread. For the McStays to miss plans or be unresponsive was highly unusual, as they had always kept in touch and stayed active with their community. Concern began to mount, and a close friend, suspicious of the family's sudden disappearance, drove over to their home to check on them. What they found was chilling. The McStay home appeared abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing that would indicate foul play. The front door was locked, and there was no visible damage to the house or surroundings. But as the friend ventured inside, the eerie details began to unfold. On the kitchen counter was a meal that was still warm, but untouched, as if it had been an abandoned meal. The family's two dogs, normally cared for with great love and attention, were left behind and wandering the house. Summer's purse, containing her ID and money, was found in the living room untouched. But the most perplexing detail of all was the absence of any signs of forced entry or anything out of place that would suggest the McStays were victims of a violent crime. There were no signs of struggle, and nothing appeared to be stolen or disturbed. In fact, it seemed as if the family had simply disappeared. It was as if they had walked out of their home and left everything behind, without even bothering to pack. As the hours passed, the police were called. The family's disappearance quickly turned into a full-scale investigation. Detectives scoured the McStay home and surrounding areas for clues, but found nothing that could explain their sudden disappearance. No ransom notes, no phone calls, no evidence of a struggle. Everything in the house was calm, almost eerily so, like the family had left in a hurry, but without a trace of why. Initial theories began to surface. Some believed the family may have run away, perhaps to escape some unknown danger or financial burden. Others speculated they may have been victims of a crime, but without any concrete evidence, no one could make a solid conclusion. The only thing that was clear was that something was terribly wrong. As days turned into weeks, the McStays' case grew colder. Their disappearance remained a mystery. Their loved ones were left wondering, had the McStays left on their own, or had something darker occurred? Were they victims of a crime, or had they run away willingly? As the McStay family's disappearance continued to baffle both their community and law enforcement, the investigation began to unfold in unexpected ways. While it seemed as though the family had vanished without a trace, certain details began to emerge that raised more questions than answers. The lack of evidence left detectives with little to go on, but the investigation was far from over. At first, authorities considered the possibility that the family had simply run away. Some believed they may have fled due to financial difficulties or personal problems. Joseph McStay's business, while successful, had faced a few setbacks in the months leading up to the disappearance. It was speculated that perhaps the family decided to start over, leaving behind their lives and possessions. After all, Joseph and Summer were both known to have somewhat unconventional ideas about their future. Yet this theory didn't sit right with many, especially those who knew the McStays well. Despite some personal struggles, there was no solid evidence to suggest that they were considering abandoning their lives. Summer was in constant contact with friends and family, and Joseph had a thriving business. Their disappearance felt too abrupt, too complete. There was no note, no phone call, no signs of anything amiss before they vanished. As the investigation continued, the authorities turned to the security footage from local businesses in the area. A breakthrough came when they found footage showing Joseph and Summer at a store just days before they went missing. In the footage, the family appeared normal, picking up some supplies. There were no signs of distress or anything out of the ordinary. However, what was more disturbing was the discovery that the family's car had been found near the border between the United States and Mexico. Detectives were stunned. Could the family have crossed the border voluntarily? Did they decide to leave the country, possibly to escape their problems? The theory of them running away took on a new angle. But there were also other theories at play. Was it possible that the McStays had been abducted and their car had been left behind as a decoy? The discovery of the car was a huge turning point. It raised questions about whether the McStays had intended to flee. But had something gone horribly wrong along the way? Investigators now faced the possibility that they might have been victims of a violent crime. Their sudden disappearance, the abandoned house, and now the car near the border hinted at something far more sinister than a simple family getaway. It was at this point that the case took a darker turn. The McStays' family and friends continued to hold on to the hope that they would be found safe. But each new lead seemed to lead to more confusion and uncertainty. As weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that the McStay family's disappearance was not an ordinary case. There was something much more complex at play. Something that law enforcement needed to uncover before it was too late. More than 4 years passed since the McStay family vanished without a trace, and their case was beginning to feel like one of the many unsolved mysteries that would never see closure. Then, in November 2013, a breakthrough came that would change everything. Authorities had all but given up hope of finding the McStays alive. The investigation had grown cold, with very few leads to follow. However, the McStays case was reignited when a pair of motorcyclists stumbled upon something unexpected in the rugged desert terrain of Southern California. The bodies of Joseph, Summer, and their 2 young children were discovered in a remote part of the desert, miles from their home. The bodies were found buried beneath a shallow grave in an area that was known to be difficult to access. The remains were in a state of decomposition, which indicated that they had been there for several years. The discovery shocked the entire nation, as the McStay family's disappearance was finally linked to a tragic and horrific end. But the real shock came when the details surrounding the burial site were revealed. The family's bodies had been carefully buried. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal their remains. The location of the grave was isolated, and there were no immediate signs of foul play, no weapons, or obvious injuries. However, the burial site was not far from the border region, where investigators had previously found the McStays' car. The question that loomed over investigators now was, who had committed this horrific crime and why? The discovery of the bodies didn't bring any immediate answers, but it raised more questions than ever before. Were the McStays killed by someone they knew, or had they been targeted by a stranger? Could the family have been murdered during their planned escape, or was there a different motive altogether? As forensic teams began to examine the remains, they made a shocking discovery. It was not just the McStay family's bodies that had been found. A chilling piece of evidence emerged, one that pointed toward a potential suspect. The authorities learned that the remains of a family dog had been buried alongside the McStays. While this wasn't conclusive proof, it raised suspicions that the family had not just disappeared voluntarily. With the discovery of the bodies, the case took a dramatic turn. The investigation had shifted from a missing persons case to a full-blown homicide investigation. Detectives now had the difficult task of piecing together what had happened to the McStay family during those final days before their deaths. The timeline was unclear, and so many aspects of the case remained unknown. However, the discovery of the bodies signaled that there were answers to be found, even if they were buried deep in the desert sands. At this point, the question on everyone's mind was clear. Who was responsible for this brutal crime? And would justice ever be served for the McStay family? With the discovery of the McStay family's bodies, investigators faced a troubling new reality. The case had gone from an unsettling disappearance to a full-blown homicide investigation. But despite the physical evidence remains, a grave. and a potential connection to the desert region near the border, the answers were still unclear. Who killed the McStay family, and why? And perhaps most disturbingly, how had the family ended up in such a desolate, isolated area? As investigators pored over the case, one theory began to gain traction. There were many things that didn't quite add up. In a deep dive into the family's past, revealed potential links to someone close to them. In particular, Joseph McStay's business dealings had come under scrutiny. Joseph, a successful designer of fountains, had built a solid reputation, and his business was growing rapidly. However, this growth had also brought him into contact with individuals who might have had personal or professional reasons to harm him. One of the primary suspects in the case was a former business partner named Chase Merritt. Merritt had been involved in Joseph's business dealings, and authorities soon discovered that he had a history of financial issues. Merritt had also been in close contact with Joseph shortly before the family disappeared. Investigators learned that Merritt was at the center of a web of financial disputes, and Joseph had recently made plans to sever ties with him. Could this be the reason why the McStays had been targeted? It was revealed that Merritt's relationship with Joseph had soured after a falling out regarding business practices and the direction of the company. As investigators dug deeper into the lives of the McStays and Merritt, they found a motive that seemed to fit: money. Joseph McStay had a successful business, and Chase Merritt had a financial stake in its success. But this wasn't just a business dispute. It appeared that Merritt may have had a more personal vendetta against Joseph. This theory gained strength when investigators found that Merritt was one of the last people to see the McStays before they vanished. Further investigation revealed that Merritt had been lying about his whereabouts on the night the family disappeared, and his financial records painted a troubling picture. While Merritt initially denied any involvement in the crime, detectives uncovered a series of inconsistencies in his statements. For example, Merritt claimed that he had been at home during the time of the McStays' disappearance, but phone records showed otherwise. Additionally, Merritt's fingerprints were found on some of the items recovered from the McStays' home, casting more suspicion on him. The case took an even darker turn when DNA evidence was found at the burial site, linking Merritt to the crime scene. But despite these developments, Merritt still denied any involvement. His alibi was falling apart, and the evidence against him continued to mount. But investigators needed more to ensure they had the right man. With Merritt at the center of the investigation, the authorities were now closer than ever to unraveling the mystery of what really happened to the McStay family. The shocking possibility that their deaths were not random, but rather the result of betrayal and greed, was becoming harder to ignore. Was Chase Merritt the killer? Or was there more to this case than anyone realized? After years of uncertainty, investigation into the McStay family's disappearance finally took a definitive turn in 2014. Chase Merritt, the former business partner of Joseph McStay, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, yet Merritt continued to deny any involvement in the deaths. Despite his claims of innocence, the case that had baffled investigators for years was now moving toward trial. The prosecution's case rested on a combination of forensic evidence, financial records, and the testimony of key witnesses. DNA found at the burial site was the most damning piece of evidence, linking Merritt directly to the crime scene. Additionally, phone records and witness statements indicated that Merritt had been in the area where the bodies were discovered. Contradicting his alibi that he had been at home on the night of the McStays' disappearance, the prosecution also highlighted the financial motive. Merritt stood to gain financially if Joseph McStay's business failed, and the two men had been involved in bitter disputes over money prior to the family's disappearance. During the trial, Merritt's defense team tried to cast doubt on the evidence, arguing that the forensic findings were inconclusive and that the financial disputes were not enough to justify murder. However, the jury was unconvinced. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Merritt's lies about his whereabouts, his financial troubles, and his strained relationship with Joseph McStay were central to understanding what had really happened to the family. In March 2015, after a lengthy and emotionally charged trial, the jury found Chase Merritt guilty of all 4 murders. The courtroom was filled with tears as the verdict was read, with the McStay family's loved ones finally receiving the justice they had been waiting for. Merritt's conviction marked the end of a long and painful chapter. But for the McStay family's survivors, it was a bittersweet moment. They had learned the truth about what happened to their loved ones, but the pain of their loss would never fully go away. Merritt was sentenced to death, but as of now, he remains on death row. His conviction was seen as a victory for justice, but it also served as a reminder of the deep betrayal and greed that led to the deaths of an innocent family. The McStays had been the victims of a crime that seemed unimaginable, a crime that was committed by someone they trusted and had worked alongside. Their deaths were not the result of a random act of violence, rather the devastating consequence of financial desperation and personal betrayal. While the McStay family's case was finally resolved, the investigation raised important questions about the nature of betrayal, greed, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their own interests. The McStays had been taken from their family and friends far too soon, but their story has ensured that their memory will never fade. Justice was served, but it came at a high cost, a cost that no family should ever have to bear. While the conviction of Chase Merritt provided a sense of closure for many, the McStay case continues to leave lingering questions. As the trial concluded and Merritt was sentenced to death, the family's loved ones began the long process of healing. Yet even with justice served, the scars of this tragedy remained. The McStays' friends, family, and community struggled with the realization that someone they had trusted, someone they had worked with, had been responsible for the deaths of a young family. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the uncertainty surrounding the final moments of the McStay family's lives. Though investigators pieced together much of the timeline, there was still no clear picture of exactly what happened in the days leading up to their deaths. How did Merritt execute such a brutal crime, and why did he choose such a remote location for the burial site? The motivations behind the killings seemed rooted in greed and betrayal, but were there other hidden factors at play? Forensic experts were able to determine that the McStays were likely murdered shortly after their disappearance. The absence of defensive wounds and the lack of visible injuries on their bodies indicated that they had been taken by surprise. Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. had been victims of a calculated act of violence, which seemed even more tragic given the peaceful life they had led up until that moment. The McStays had been planning a future together, looking forward to family trips and making memories, but instead, their lives were cut short by someone who had been entrusted with their trust and friendship. The remote desert burial site also raised many questions. Investigators speculated that Merritt had chosen this location because of its isolation, making it unlikely that the bodies would be found quickly. The fact that the graves were shallow and poorly concealed suggested that Merritt was not as careful as he thought he was, and the discovery of the remains was largely a matter of chance. It's unclear whether Merritt ever intended to have the McStays' bodies found. Some believe that Merritt may have thought the family would be gone forever, and that their disappearance would remain an unsolved mystery. But in the end, the desert did not hold its secrets for long. The case also shined a light on the potential dangers of trusting business partners, particularly in situations where financial pressures are at play. The McStays were not just victims of an isolated act of violence. They were casualties of a deeper, more insidious issue: greed. Merritt, facing mounting debts and financial struggles, may have felt that murder was the only way to resolve his problems. What started as a partnership built on trust ended in a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. For the McStay family's loved ones, the journey toward closure remains ongoing. While justice was ultimately served, the emotional scars left by the murders are not so easily healed. The McStays' legacy lives on in the memories of those who loved them, and their story serves as a sobering reminder of how far people can go when driven by desperation and greed.